I apologize for the stumbles there. Hi, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County. I'm going to be talking to you about irrigation in the home landscape. So I want to start off, irrigation is a balancing act. We want to maintain a given soil moisture. We want the amount of moisture in the soil that is going to be ideal for plant growth. So we have to balance things. We don't want there to be too little water, and we certainly don't want there to be too much. If we add too much water, then that water will sort of force out the air that's going to be there in the soil, and that replaces all of the oxygen that's in the rooting area. And plants need to take up oxygen through their roots. They respire just the way that we do. So forcing all of that oxygen out can be really damaging to the plants. By the same token, if we don't have enough moisture, if plants aren't able to take up that water, they're going to start restricting their water flow. They'll close the stomates that allow water to transpire out of the plant, and we'll start to see them wilting. And as that continues forward, we may see all sorts of signs of drought stress in the plant and potentially death of the plant. So the role of irrigation is to replace water that is lost from the soil. Water is lost by transpiration, by the movement of water by the plants, and by evaporation as well. So again, we're just trying to balance the amount of water that is being lost from the soil with the amount of water that we're adding in. And in addition to us adding water to the soil, there are other things that add that water. So of course, irrigation is what we're here to talk about today. And irrigation is a water addition to the landscape. But we also need to consider the effect of rainfall, because the rate of rainfall and how much water we're getting from rainfall is going to be important to how much we need to add through irrigation. One thing that we want to consider is that the rate of rainfall also affects how that water is going to infiltrate the soil. Here in the South, we get those big thunderstorms where we have just a massive amount of water coming down almost all at once. And so if we have a lot of water coming down all at once, a lot of that's not going to be able to infiltrate into the soil. It's going to run off in comparison with a very slow sort of gradual rain that adds that water gradually to the soil as it can be taken up. Another factor or another addition of water to the landscape is what we can call run-on. And run-on is if we have other properties around where we live, around our landscape that are higher elevations, we may have water running onto our property from those other areas. If we live in a place where it's dry or if we're under drought conditions, run-on is great. But it can also be damaging if we have an area where water is accumulating. And that's a common problem that I'm called out for homeowners to take a look at, is where water is sort of accumulating in an area in the landscape. So all of this is balanced out by the water subtractions from the landscape. And part of that is just evaporation. During the high temperature, that water is evaporating, going from solid to a vapor and going up into the air. And of course, that's going to be dependent on temperature, and just the relative humidity is going to affect evaporation. And we can slow that down by adding mulch. So mulch will limit the amount of soil loss or soil water loss we have through evaporation. Added to that, we have transpiration, and that is the movement of the water through the plant that's being then evaporated out of the stomata. And oftentimes you'll see these two things combined into what they'll call evapotranspiration or some combination of the two words like that. Of course, we do also have runoff, and runoff is just the water moving down the gradient running off onto other properties that might be lower than us. And if you have driveways or sidewalks where the water's hitting, that's going to contribute to runoff because that water is going to much more easily move. It's not going to percolate down into the soil. Leaching is basically the same thing. It's just the water moving downwards. If you apply more water than soil can hold, it's going to move downward in through the soil profile, down below where the plants are going to be able to access it. And this can be really important because as it does that, sometimes it takes some of those water-soluble compounds like fertilizers that the plant needs and moves it out of the reach of the plants. So again, what we're trying to do is balance out the water additions and the water subtractions to keep the level of water that we have in our landscape exactly where the plants want it. One of the very frequent things that we're trying to decide to do is when do we irrigate? And for lawns, there are a couple of different methods that we can use to do this. I think the most reliable way is to really just look at the soil and see what the soil moisture is like. The very simplest method to do this, you can use a screwdriver or a garden trowel, something like that. Push that down to a depth of about 4 to 6 inches and pull up a little bit of the soil. If it feels really dry, then you want to turn on the irrigation system. If it feels really wet, then you don't really need that irrigation. And that's just a kind of a direct way of saying whether we need to irrigate or not. Really, there's no better way than just looking directly at what the water content in our soil is. When we're talking about lawns, a common method that is used is called footprinting. And really that is just walking across your lawn and turning around and seeing if you can see your footprints. And grass is going to be a little bit more springy when it has all the water it needs. And so if you can see those footprints, that's a really good sign that the plants need a little bit more water and that you need to turn on that irrigation.
9, 5, 8, 7, 7.
Sorry about that. Now, there are some, of course, going back to footprinting, obviously if the grass feels really crispy or crunchy, that's a sign that you absolutely need to irrigate. But looking at those, that sort of footprints as a sign that you need to irrigate is kind of a simple way of approaching the problem. Now, of course, there are more complicated ways that we can do this that rely on calculating the actual plant water use, which involves a great deal of mathematics that really measures, at the specific temperature and relative humidity, how much water is going to be transpired through those plants. That's really not a practical method for homeowners. I wouldn't want to start approaching that math. There are some other fascinating ways to do it. There's a way of actually measuring soil moisture a little bit more directly using a tool called a tensiometer, which really just measures the moisture tension in the soil. And I'm including this for interest. I don't think that generally this is something that I would expect a homeowner to use as a tool for irrigation. But sometimes you see these used in commercial production or you see them used in research as a method to figure out what the relative amount of moisture is in the soil or how much is being lost from the soil. They work really interestingly. It's just a hollow plastic tube. The one that you see in an image there is kind of a homemade one. It has a porous tip on one end, a small water reservoir on the other, and it has a vacuum gauge. As it loses water, basically that generates a vacuum as the water is wicked out, and that increases the measure of the vacuum and kind of gives you a measure of what the actual soil moisture is. Basically, as the water is dry or as the soil is drier, it's going to be wicking out that water from that measure. So kind of an interesting tool to actually directly measure soil moisture. for most homeowners, I really think just digging up a small amount of the soil and kind of seeing where it is a good method to do that. Now, one thing that we also want to consider is, of course, how much water we're going to need to add. And this is something that we need to consider when we talk about our landscape design, because you really want to group plants together that kind of have similar water needs. So if you have succulents right next to water-loving plants, very often they're going to have really drastically different water needs. It's going to be difficult to supply them exactly what they need without either oversupplying or undersupplying some of those nutrients. Plan those beds with an idea of what those water requirements are going to be. And really importantly, spend time out in your landscape. Look at the conditions of the plants. And if you start to see symptoms of drought, or if you start to see symptoms of overwatering, one of the most important things we can do with an irrigation system is adjust it to best fit the needs of the plants in our landscape as we see it. But I am often asked, how much water should I set my irrigation system to add, either to my lawn or to landscape beds? And generally, just kind of to start with a rule of thumb, we can say that about 1 inch of water per week is a good approach. Keep in mind that, that's going to vary according to the plant type, the stage of the plant's growth, what the temperature is outdoors, what time of year it is. This is a really broad rule of thumb and really needs to be adjusted based on your specific landscape. So how much water are we actually applying when we turn on the irrigation system? Really kind of a straightforward way of testing this is to use some little cans. You can set up tuna cans, work really well because they're a good shallow depth and they sit there on the soil really easily. You want to place those out at several different areas of your landscape and turn the irrigation system on. And then, after an hour, you can go out there, see how much water is in each of those cans, because you might not be applying the same amount of water to different areas of the landscape. And you can just average that across the cans and figure out how much actual water you are applying when you turn on that irrigation system. It can be really important for figuring out how long you're going to want to leave it on. Of course, the other question that we talk about when we talk about irrigation is what time of day we should irrigate. And very often, this is something that gets argued about quite a bit, and I see different people applying different practices when we talk about when to irrigate. We want to think about, that transpiration and evaporation, or if we want to use the term evapotranspiration, is going to be highest when the temperature is really high. So between about 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., we're going to lose a lot of water that we're putting out there because it just goes away as steam. Watering in the hot part of the day, we're going to lose somewhere between 20 to 30% of that water just from the effects of evaporation, and it's not going to be serving the purposes of our plants. We're going to be able to retain a lot more of that if we water at a cooler time of day. And generally speaking, what we want to do is irrigate in the early morning. Begin right after the dew is dried from the plant leaves. Gives you a little bit of a gap or a dry period when the plant is not going to have that water on it, which, as we've previously discussed, having that water on there for a long period of time is really necessary for disease development. So having that little gap of dry time is going to be beneficial to reducing our disease pressure. But to try to give you a range, generally that recommendation is going to be somewhere between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Or 10 a.m., excuse me, as to what time we should actually water. And if you're irrigating in the morning, I'm going to call that correct and think you're doing a pretty good job. It's also important that we consider what our soil type is, because that is going to affect our water use. Different types of soils are going to have a different amount of water that they can hold. Sandy soil particles are really large, really allow water to pass through them very quickly, and they don't hold a lot of water. By contrast, a clay soil tends to drain very slowly and hold more water than a sandy soil. So what this affects is how frequently we are going to water in order to apply that 1 inch of water per week that we're generally going to be applying to our lawns and to our landscape beds. So if you have an extremely coarse sand, you want to irrigate more frequently. So, irrigating 3 times per week with about 1/3 of the water that you would normally apply. So about 0.3 to 0.35 inches each time. If we have a really heavy clay soil, you just want to water once a week and apply about 1 inch of water at that time, because that soil is going to be really able to hold that water. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you kind of balance between the two and apply a half inch of water twice. Practically speaking, a lot of us are just going to be eyeballing that and going out and seeing how well our soil is holding water, and judging from that based on how frequently we need to apply that water. Just keep in mind, we really want to apply water as infrequently as we can, and water deeply, because we want to promote the development of deep root systems in our plants. And if we water daily and just apply a light amount of water, that tends to produce shallow root systems, promote weed development. And if we do wind up in a drought condition, our plants with shallow root systems are going to be a lot less able to cope with that situation. So I want to spend some time talking about the different irrigation equipment. Of course, the classic is an impact sprinkler. I mostly see these in ornamental areas, but operates using the impact motion. And this is that classic sprinkler that kind of rotates around and sends out little jets of water all over the place. You will occasionally see these as pop-up sprinklers, basically so they don't get damaged and they're not so obtrusive in the environment. And that's, sort of an inconspicuous and convenient way to irrigate the lawn. More frequently these days, I see spray heads. They kind of pop up the same way, cover the entire area to be irrigated. They tend to irrigate a lot faster than a spray head, than a impact sprinkler would. And they give that water out in a pattern that's kind of determined by the nozzle. So it might be a quarter of a circle or a half of a circle or a full circle, sort of dependent upon what the need is for that area. We often see those in ornamental beds or lawn areas that are too small for a sprinkler. And again, they do apply water much faster than you would expect for a sprinkler. My preference by far is for drip irrigation. These, unlike the impact sprinkler or spray head, these apply their water only to the root zone of the plant, so you never wind up spraying water out into the air, which makes them a lot more efficient in terms of getting water to the area where the plants actually need it. We also avoid irrigating large areas where we're not actually putting plants. And what time of day they operate is a lot less important, because again, they're not exposing the leaves to water to exacerbate any disease issues. And because they're generally put down under a mulch layer, evaporation is much less of a serious problem. So I'm going to talk about the different components in a drip system. Of course, drip tubing is the core element of this. Most of these are in a 16 millimeter diameter, or we'll call it a 600 or 630 size, which is about a half-inch tube. And that is going to be large enough to provide pretty much all of the adequate water that you're going to need in the landscape, but it's small enough that it's really kind of unobtrusive, and you don't wind up, sort of seeing it as a negative to the appearance of the landscape. And generally, you're just going to snake that or curve it through the landscape bed, move that tubing next to the plants that have to be irrigated. And one thing you want to do if you're staking this or moving it around your landscape is you want to avoid kinks. And so they have fittings for elbow or T-shapes if you need to make a sharp turn. And those fit together really simply. You just sort of press them onto those fittings, and they lock that way. So it really doesn't require any tools other than a good pair of garden shears or a sharp knife to cut the tubing. Attached to that tubing is going to be the emitter, which is just poked into that tubing. Basically, they have a barb connector that allows you to connect them directly into the main drip tube or main irrigation tubing. And the purpose of this drip emitter is to regulate the water flow. And there are different flow rates that come out of these emitters. Oftentimes they're color coded. So you'll find them that are half gallon per hour or gallon per hour or 2 gallons per hour. And this can be really useful if you have different plants next to each other that kind of require different amounts of water. You can turn the water on for the same amount of time and deliver different amounts of water to different plants. One thing that's really good about these emitters is that they operate really the same way as different amounts of pressure are in the system. So if you have one drip emitter down at the end of the system where you might have a little bit less pressure, you won't see a change in how much water they send out in comparison to something that's going to be closer to where your water source is. Very often we also use microsprayers. These basically operate the same way that an emitter does. They just spray water instead of slowly dripping it out. They tend to have much higher flow rates, where you're looking at somewhere between 0 and 1 gallon for a drip emitter. These microsprayers have flow rates that might be 5 gallons per hour or 60 gallons per hour. Usually you'll see these in a form where they have a stake, so you can kind of set them down into the ground. And they'll spray, and oftentimes you'll also find versions of them that are adjustable. These work really well for pots and for containers because the soil that is in containers or the potting media that we use often loses water very quickly. And if we just include a drip emitter, sometimes that drip emitter will have that water go straight down, and it'll go through part of the root zone, but not the entire root zone of the plant. And so using microsprayers with containers is a really effective way to make sure that we have the entire root system receive the water that it needs. I think they're really suitable for things like salad tables and things like containers. In the ground, I really like emitters because that ground soil tends to allow that water to move laterally or kind of spread out a little bit more easily. When we talk about vegetable beds or vegetable gardens, I really like to use drip tape. Drip tape is basically a thin irrigation line with emitters kind of built into it, usually at an 8 or 12 or sometimes 18-inch spacing. And you just have a connector that connects that to the main drip tubing and run that down the line. You can plant right next to it based on the spacing of the emitters that are there in that tubing. And oftentimes drip tape is really not intended to be used year after year. We've certainly kept some, in some of the gardens I work with, kept some of that drip tape for much longer than that. But it's relatively inexpensive and easy to replace and very effective in raised beds or even in the ground vegetable gardens as a way to deliver that water. Some other components we're going to need in drip irrigation. We are going to need a filter and a pressure regulator. That water that's coming out of our faucet tends to be coming out at a pretty high pressure. and will generally sort of pop out or sort of blow out the emitters that we have in our drip tubing. So we generally want to knock that pressure down to about 30 psi. And so you can buy a pressure regulator that will keep that pressure lower and prevent that from being a problem. They just kind of help you maintain the sort of the exact amount of pressure you want to maintain to keep the same amount of water flowing without damaging the system. Filters are also necessary. The emitter openings are very small, so if you have any material that gets in there, from your water source, that can block up those emitters and keep them from putting out that water. So having that filter into the system just makes sure that we don't have any clogs showing up. Of course, the business end, the really important part, I think, is a timer. There are a lot of really inexpensive timers that are available, and I select them, based on the number of zones I need. Sometimes they're going to have one hose attachment. You can see an image there for a timer system that has 4 different hose attachments, and that allows you to connect different areas of your landscape to the timer and set it for a different amount of time, all coming off of that one faucet. So from that system, you're allowed to set that water timer to go off 3 days a week for an hour, or every day, or 3 times in a single day, depending on what you're trying to water in your landscape. The important thing here is that while timers are absolutely a boon to our watering, they can also present a problem. We tend to set things and forget them. And we really need to be out there investigating what's going on in our landscape and making sure that the watering is where it needs to be so that we can adjust it, particularly as we go through different times of year. As the climate changes, the plants are going to need more or less water. And we want to keep rainfall in mind. So if we've gotten 3 inches of rain, we need to turn that timer off so that we can let the rainfall serve rather than the irrigation water. So just putting together a simple irrigation system, you can see the components here that you're going to need. The first part is going to be a timer. This model just has one outlet, so we're just going to be one setting for the area that we're irrigating. The next piece that you'll commonly see is going to be a backflow preventer, so that if there's some reason why water moves backwards back into our water source, that just prevents that from happening. After that, we have our filter. You can see the little filter basket there. You do need to clean that out every now and again. After that, we have our pressure regulator, and that connects directly to the main hose that we're going to use to deliver water. And pictured there, that's a 1/2-inch tubing that serves very well. You'll find that in 50-foot lengths or 100-foot lengths, can very easily cut it to the length you need. And off of that, we'll very normally have a barb connector that will be to a 1/4-inch line that will connect directly to those emitters right next to the plants that we are going to need. And while sometimes those barb connectors are designed to be able to be pushed in just by hand, if you're doing a whole bunch of those in the course of a day, there's a tool there that can be used to punch those holes to make getting those barb connectors or those connectors into that system much, much easier. One thing we do want to consider when we're talking about setting a system like this up is how much water we have coming out of that faucet or out of our water source, and how much water we're actually we're trying to get out. So we need to add together all of those emitters. If we have 50 half-gallon emitters, then that tells us that we're putting out 25 gallons of water. So we want to make sure that we're not exceeding the maximum flow rate for the area that we are trying to water. One really easy way to figure out whether we're doing that or not is just get a bucket, 5-gallon bucket, turn on that water full force and time how long it takes to fill it up. And then you can do some really simple math and come up with what your flow actually is per hour. So if you fill a 5-gallon bucket up in 1 minute or 60 seconds, so you divide 5 by 60, multiply that by 3,600, and that gives you the amount of gallons per hour that you're putting out. So really kind of a straightforward math there. And of course, you can pull up the file of this to get that little quick math right there to kind of know what's going on. One really important thing, if your flow rate is less than what you need, if you have more landscape, other than using a separate water source, you can just separate the system out into different zones and then water them separately. So if you have 300 gallons per hour and you need to use 300 gallons per hour on one section and 300 gallons per hour on another, if you just water them at separate times, set the timer to water one zone at time A and one zone at time B, you still have the water requirements that you're going to need for that system. So here's just a kind of a simple graphic that I found that just serves as a way to kind of graphically describe what we're putting together. We have our water valve or our faucet, the backflow preventer, pressure regulator, our filter, and then our tubing adapter. Of course, we do need to add a timer in there. And then that connects to the drip tubing. I don't agree with the 18-inch minimum between emitters, but this was a kind of a simple graphic just for the essential parts that you need to have this system working. Very often we use drip irrigation in raised beds, really effective. Drip tape works very well in the system. You can connect that right into that 1/2-inch tubing and just make sure that we put our plants right along where those emitters are going to be. And keep in mind that as we're watering raised beds very much act like containers. They lose water much more quickly than we would see in the ground. And so very often we actually need to water our raised beds more than once a day as we get into the really hot time of year. And it is really important to regularly monitor how that water is moving in that bed and how wet your soil is staying to make sure that we're getting all of the water that the plants in our raised beds need. In ornamental beds, you can see how that irrigation line can be kind of snaked through all of the plants just to be adjacent to the plant that needs to receive that water. Very often it's then covered over with mulch, so we don't even see that irrigation line, and we avoid a lot of the problems that we would have in evaporation. We also tend to be able to keep some of the animal damage away from it. Sometimes small mammals like to chew our irrigation line, and covering it up with mulch may be helpful. So you can see on that second image where you have a spray stake or a microsprayer attached in off of that irrigation line. If you don't want to be attached to a faucet, some people do design rain barrel systems where rainwater is collected and put into a drip system and used to water raised beds or foundation plantings and things like that, which is a great water conservation tool. If you've got a system where you can lift that water and use gravity to feed into the system, is a great way to have an off-the-grid irrigation system as a way to deliver water to your plants. So I appreciate it. I know that was a very basic run through of how to construct an irrigation system.